So I'm sure the one thing that we've all noticed is that playing cards are all getting thinner. It's actually quite rare nowadays that we see a custom deck that is deliberately printed to be a bit thicker. It obviously still happens. I know people like Jason Ladani who printed the was it the Clover or the Lucky playing cards, something along those lines. He deliberately chose a premium or a B stock for his cards, but nowadays, a lot of the decks that you see are actually catered to be a bit thinner, right? Me personally, I much prefer thick decks, but I definitely do I definitely do understand the appeal for thinner decks. So let's discuss the differences between a thicker deck and a thinner deck, and what each of those stocks sort of offer. Now let's begin this by prefacing that although I prefer thicker cards, you should just use whichever deck that you like. It's your hands and only you get to choose what you want to use. I'm only here to look at things a bit more logically, so yeah. So let's compare these two decks, right? This is the RJRTC-B deck. It's probably one of the thicker decks that I own. I do have decks that I think might be slightly thicker, but if I think of a thick deck, oof, that's a that's a bunch of words. If I think of a thick deck, this deck is usually what I would be thinking of. Now, the other deck I have, which is the thin deck, is the Absolute Vodkas, which are universally known to be probably one of, if not the thinnest decks out there, the thinnest usable decks out there. Obviously, there's cards like manipulation cards or the double decker Phoenix cards, right? There's those decks, but these are the ones that are usable, right? I do believe that the Cardistry Con Mexico deck is a recent deck that is actually thinner than the Absolute Vodkas, but I think universally the Absolute Vodkas are recognized to be the thinnest deck out there, the thinnest usable deck out there. So I believe the thickness difference between these two is about 10 cards, if I try and compress all these. Right, so let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9. It's okay, so 9 cards thicker. So on the surface, although it just seems like thickness is the only difference, and it might be-ish, so it actually does matter quite a bit, right? Having a deck be thicker or thinner, that actually does matter quite a bit. In cardistry, having a thinner deck means that it will be easier to perform certain types of moves, right? For example, moves where packets need to clear other packets will be easier because now you don't have a big chunk blocking you, right? Like even for people with smaller hands, I would imagine that thinner cards would be easier if you're doing like a thumb cut, right? If my thumb needs to wrap around the deck, it'll be easier if I have a thinner deck versus if I have a thicker deck. I would need to wrap. It would take a lot more effort for my thumb to wrap around the deck, and then I would need to do a thumb cut, right? Or even things like an interlock, right? If I do an interlock, this packet over here is quite small, right? So only this little packet needs to go through this gap. Versus if I had a thicker deck, I would need this entire chunk over here to actually just slip in between of my fingers, right? So cardistry wise, thicker decks versus thinner decks definitely do have an impact. Or even moves like the let's just say the tornado cut, right? Where you're pivoting this packet on the base of your thumb and your pinky, right? If you actually use thicker decks or more cards, it's actually quite easy for this packet to actually just slip off of any of the pressure points, right? So having a thinner deck definitely helps. I just like using thicker cards just because sometimes my fingers are fat and latching onto a packet of thin cards is hard, right? For example, if I'm doing something like fission, right? Sometimes it's a bit harder for me to separate each individual packet, right? But if I have a thicker deck, it actually makes it easier for me to feel out each individual card, and I could just separate the packets relatively simply, right? Relatively simpler, just like so, right? But again, it really depends on the person. Again, like I said, Even in Magic, right, thickness does play a role for performing certain types of moves or how a certain move actually comes across. You'll most definitely feel the difference between palming a thin card versus a thick card. Guy Hollingworth actually had the okay, wait, this is also some backstory, right? The very first Crush stock deck was the Guy Hollingworth playing cards, right? And the reason why they actually used a Crush stock was because Guy Hollingworth just really liked the studs, and he really liked that very, very thin feeling because the cards just felt more flexible and comfortable when he was palming the hell out of them. So if you actually tried palming, any sort of thin deck, you'll notice that it's actually quite easier to actually bend the cards, right? Because they're more flexible, right? It's like bending a sheet of paper, right? And it's just resting there, right? Versus if you actually try palming a thicker deck, you can definitely feel the difference. It's like sort of bending a piece of cardboard. Obviously, you can still palm it, but it doesn't exactly feel the same as palming a thinner deck of cards. You'll also most definitely be able to spot the difference between a double formed by the Absolute Vodkas and a double formed with the RJRTCB playing cards, right? So for example, if I had a double formed by the Absolute Vodkas, this is what it looks like, right? Very thin, it even looks like a single card, right? There's not much of a difference over here, but it's obviously a double. Versus if you had a double formed by the RJRTCB playing cards, right? There's actually a bit more heft to it, right? So you actually take a look at the double formed over here, right? You can tell that it's actually just thicker, right? It's actually thicker by a bit, right? Now I know spectators won't be able to tell that there's actually a difference between like this double and this double, but there's still obviously a visible difference between both cards, right? Between both doubles, right? So yeah, these are both doubles. So even for Magic, that does play a role. For me personally, I actually prefer thick cards because for a lot of feel type moves like the pinky count, I actually think that it's actually quite difficult to tell each individual card apart, right? Sometimes the cards are so thin that I'm not sure if I'm counting 2 cards or more, right? So if I'm riffling here, right, for a pinky count, did I count 2 or did I count more, right? No, that's 3, right? No, that's 2, what? See, so it gets confusing because it's actually harder to feel out each individual card versus if you had something like this, where each card is a bit more hefty, a bit more substantial, so you can actually feel out each individual card easier, right? So it really depends on the person, but maybe it's just a matter of me using thick cards more often, so I'm probably just more used to them. But I definitely do think that for feeling type moves like the pinky count or riffle stacking, I do think that thicker cards do play a role in that, okay? Now on a deeper level, usually, thicker cards will be stiffer than thinner cards, but of course that depends on the manufacturer. For example, China printed cards will often be quite a bit thinner than USPCC playing cards. For example, the recently released Second Wind playing cards that I made a review of, that deck is actually a bit thinner than a bicycle deck of playing cards, but it is actually stiffer, mainly because it is, again, a China printed deck, right? But it is still stiffer, like I said. So usually you need to spend more time breaking in thicker decks to soften them up, right? So that is something that you have to trade off because they are generally stiffer, right? So you'll need to spend more time pulling them out of the box, right? Doing a couple of springs, bridges, and all that stuff to really break them in. Versus, well, thinner decks, right? They're already soft, so then you can already just basically do a couple of moves with them, make sure that they don't slide around. And so breaking thinner cards in is a lot easier, right? But on the flip side, that also means that thicker cards traditionally last longer because they'll be kept in shape better and they'll basically just preserve that snap for a bit longer, right? Because again, they're naturally stiffer, which makes it so that they are easier to to conserve that snap, right? Versus thinner cards, which are very much so flimsier, right? Which means that they'll lose that snap a lot faster than thicker cards, right? But again, do note that this is just a general rule of thumb and that the manufacturer will cause differences. Also do note that even though thicker cards are known to be more durable than thinner cards, the deck clicks that are caused by moisture will affect all decks regardless of thickness, because all the decks are just paper, right? And paper will react the same way regardless of moisture, right? So do take note of that, okay? But those are the main differences. It's just, well, thickness does play a role in how cards feel, especially when palmed, or especially when seen. And it also does play a role in how cards feel when you are doing certain types of moves, right? Like for cardistry or even for Magic. And of course, they also play a role in how long the cards last and how much time you have to spend to break them in. So do take note of that. It's why actually a lot of performers actually prefer the Tally-Ho Elites from Penguin Magic. It's because they're actually crushed, and so they look like normal Tally-Hos, but they're actually crushed, so that makes it so that you can just pull them out, and then, you know, they're already soft, they're already smooth and all that stuff. And so those are just some differences between thin and thick cards. Now again, those are just general rules of thumb, and a lot of these will depend on the manufacturer. For me personally, again, like I said, I prefer thicker cards because there's just something that's more, I don't know, that's just better for me when I'm handling something that's a bit more substantial, a bit heftier, if that makes sense. Maybe I just like the feeling of just handling or feeling out each individual card, and just having a bit more like heft in my hands, right? Because this does feel heavier compared to this deck, right? This feels like I'm holding air versus this is like, oh yeah, I'm actually holding something, right? So it does play a role. But again, this all depends on personal preference. So whether a certain type of stock or finish feels better in your hands, or you're looking at things from a more logical perspective by considering the differences that I presented in the video, it really depends on you, right? Everything is up to you. I can't tell how your hands are. I don't know what your preferences are. So really, don't let anyone tell you that one deck is inherently better for you, right? Certain decks will be better for maybe certain situations and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, try different decks, right? Try different decks and determine what works out for you. I mean, I've tried a lot of decks, and personally, this deck over here, it's the best deck for me. But yeah, I think that about wraps it up. Yeah, stay healthy, stay safe, and continue testing out and using different decks, and use whichever deck that you like. See you guys next time.